I absolutely love the brand. I'm also conscious of the fact that it probably cannot survive exclusively on a group of people who love the brand but don't necessarily buy the cars.
It's the Church of England problem, isn't it?
People love the church. The brand. I'm not going. I'm not going to church.
Yeah.
No, I want it to exist.
Yes.
But I'm not going to participate.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by the Spectator's Wikiman correspondent, Rory Sutherland. Rory, welcome to Spec TV. Thanks for joining us today. The subject of our discussion is Jaguar's rebrand. Tell us what on earth they were thinking.
Well, there's several components to it. And there's one very big missing component, which of course is a car. And it's worth noting that Jaguar has done this in a period where it is manufacturing no cars at all. It was a decision taken, I think, by an earlier CEO, which was effectively to do a complete reboot. In other words, they had one electric car, which was the I-Pace, pretty well acclaimed, pretty successful, but apparently the architecture was wrong for what they were planning, or the price point was wrong. And so an earlier chief executive effectively decided we're going to do a complete reboot. We relaunch as a wholly electric car company. I can see half of the Spectator readership fulminating away at this point. And we're also going to up the price point considerably, much, much closer to Bentley than to, I suppose, there was a time when they aspired almost to be a mass car manufacturer. And they're going to abandon that completely and go pretty much to the luxurious end of the performance car market. And so what they've done is they've done this rather strange advertisement, which isn't to my taste. By the way, I've had 5 Jags. I mean,
You're a Jags man.
Yeah, absolutely. At the moment, I have the Ford Mustang Mach-E, which I absolutely love, but I'm still persuadable. I'd consider going back to the Jag, though perhaps not at the price point they envisage, at least not new, maybe second-hand. But it's aroused a huge amount of noise, mostly hostile, much of it from car purists, remember. And I might argue to a degree, some very, very shrewd marketers, among them Mark Ritson, writing in Marketing Week, have fundamentally accused it of being tone deaf, saying that it misses, Jaguar's sort of heritage points.
Yes.
And that the ad is kind of gratuitous, that it completely seems detached from both the car's British origins, which I think do matter, by the way. And I think quite a bit of Ritson's criticism is possibly fair, but I'm going to reserve judgment. And the reason I'm going to reserve judgment is that they don't yet have a car. This is, to some extent, in the realm of teaser advertising. Again, not to my taste, but nonetheless, I think interesting. I don't dislike the new logo. They seem to have removed the snarling cat head on, which they had a technical name for, which I'm not going to share in a family broadcast. They've kept the prancing cat. They've introduced a slightly unusual typeface, which some people hate, with a capital G in the middle of Jaguar. I don't dislike it at all. I've had 5 Jaguars. To be honest, I think it's entirely in keeping with the brand to do something thoroughly revolutionary and strange, because it's done that in the past. It's done it with the E-Type. It's done it with the Mark II, the XK120, of course. And I'd also make the point that you've got to be very, very careful, as any car manufacturer, listening too much to car people. Because car obsessives often know too much about cars to be actually helpful, in that they obsess about things that ordinary car buyers are completely indifferent about. And you might argue that the car industry, in fact, Clarkson, who I regard as a pretty interesting commentator on this, has made the point that the obsession with the Nürburgring performance has led to cars that are far less comfortable than people would really like. So you have absurd trends in the car industry, one of them being these enormous alloy wheels with very thin, low-profile tyres. What that means is that the wheels are much more expensive, the tyres are more expensive, you're almost certain to scrape and ruin your alloys every time you enter an NCP car park and try and navigate between the curbs, because, of course, the alloys are almost always in contact with the concrete because they're so goddamn big. They're incredibly uncomfortable, okay? So you lose on about 6 dimensions, but what you would gain theoretically is if you were to go around the Nürburgring, you'd go around 1.5 seconds faster because of these tyres. And so we've got to be slightly careful about listening to car purists talking about cars. When David Ogilvy wrote the advertisement, at 60 miles an hour, the loudest thing in the new Rolls-Royce is the ticking of the electric clock, the people at Rolls-Royce were angry because he was talking about the clock, not about the drivetrain or the transmission or whatever it was they wanted him to talk about. So it's worth noting that there are a lot of people, myself included, who love the Jaguar brand, who want it to succeed. I think this is a bit of a new Labour moment in that for the moment, I'm not sure they'll lose the affection of their existing audience. And I think what they're hoping to do, and as I said, I reserve judgment on their marketing simply because in the absence of a car, we don't yet know whether this is effectively hype or indeed, a worthwhile drum roll for something extraordinary. What I think they're hoping to do, which I think they have to do, is to reach out to a different audience. And it's complicated by the fact that the whole normal hierarchy of car brands has been disrupted by electrification. So, a lot of marketers would say, oh, well, in order to be a premium car brand, you have to have heritage. Okay, you have to have Le Mans heritage. You have to harken back to, Jim Clark and
black and white photos,
etc. Spitfires flying in front of the White Cliffs of Dover. That kind of imagery, which is probably relevant in Britain but not elsewhere. They have to sell globally. That's one part of it. The second part is if you look at the success of Korean brands, which were kind of Johnny-come-latelys only 6 or 7 years ago, they're now serious players in the electric car market. And so we also have to face BYD and Geely and Chinese manufacturers coming in with much lower prices. So where you go, it is fair to say that electrification does fundamentally change, as the Germans are discovering to their horror. It changes what's important about a car because they're probably all going to be pretty reliable. I'll park the range anxiety question because I think it's to some extent a bit of a distraction. Okay. They're all going to be really quiet. The performance is going to be, if I went and bought, for example, an electric Skoda, or, particularly with the premium high battery version, the performance would be sports car level in terms of the internal combustion engine. The quietness is also kind of not quite Bentley level, but it's not far off, okay? So even really, really cheap cars are going to have aspects of performance cars and aspects of luxury cars in terms of the quietness, the performance, and probably the reliability. So the things on which the Germans effectively built a perceptual empire of kind of engineering excellence, electrification does change that. There are plenty of other categories where a technological arrival has effectively disrupted what you might call, we have a pantheon of brands in something. Sony being, if you like, wrong-footed in video recorders by the arrival of VHS versus Betamax, for instance. There are cases where a brand's hard-won reputation does become eroded through a major technological change. And given that Jaguar decided to go all electric, and I'm going to park that decision because, again, that's debate for people who know far more about this stuff than I do. But given that decision, they were probably right at least to acknowledge they're going to be operating in a different place.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
But given that, and the fact that electrification mean that instead it's going to be much more of an even playing field in that sense of reliability, surely things like the idiosyncrasies, like the English brand, the Englishness, the thing Jaguar, that ought to be preserved. And that was what's so striking to me.
That, by the way.
Is so striking is watching it is how homogenous the advert seems. Their sort of identity's gone. And I worry perhaps from Jaguar it's going to lose that English thing, everything that you think of it being evocative, as English as Norse.
I mean, it's, as I said, it's emphatically not my kind of advertising. Equally, it is partly simply by dint of the absence of a car. It's uncharacteristic for car advertising. There's a whole question, by the way, about where cars compete in the electric world, in the sense that, as I said, fairly basic cars are going to be as fast as a normal person would want to go, accelerating as much as a normal person would want to drive, and as quiet as a sane person could hope for. There are those benefits. So where do you go? Now, speaking to the guy who's the expert at Wired magazine on electric cars, he wondered whether it becomes all about the interior. In other words, or is it all about the design? Is it all about the aesthetics? Not a bad thing, actually. I mean, when car manufacturers really competed on aesthetics, we got the 56 Cadillac, and we had the glorious fins. We had, in some ways, a bit more variety in appearance with cars would be a pretty welcome thing, because they have become tragically homogeneous in terms of how they look.
And what's so striking for me from this conversation is that, people have talked about Jaguar and their head of marketing and what the internal culture of Jaguar is, but really is that this is something happening across the industry, and sort of maybe Jaguar, by dint of events, have been forced first through that wall.
Well, I'm also going to be a bit cautious here, because there are a lot of instances where car people, particularly purists, hate things and then admit they're wrong. So, for example, I do have quite a lot of faith in the creative director of Jaguar, given that he was the man behind the Defender. Now, a lot of purists absolutely despised the Defender when it arose, because they thought it should be a farmer's stroke military vehicle, and here we have this semi-luxury vehicle. Yes, I get it, by the way. I sort of agree with them with my car purist hat on. I think they're right. Nonetheless, it's a magnificent vehicle which seems to be selling incredibly well, and it looks fantastic. Okay. People hated Chris Bangle when he took over as design director at BMW. I think some of his work, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, actually turns out to be, I nearly said iconic. I'm not going to say, but it was actually an extraordinarily important part of, I think, the reinvention of a great brand. And so you have to keep these things fresh. You have to fundamentally innovate quite dramatically. And there will always be people who, in a sense, if you absolutely love steam trains, okay, I agree with you. You're right. I agree with the people who love internal combustion engines, who love, a little bit of oil leaking onto the floor. I understand all of that. But perhaps those people shouldn't be put in charge of a railway, if you see what I mean. And so ultimately, what do you do? Volvo is perhaps in a similar kind of position. Volvo always describes itself as we're a 1% car company. We have 1% of market share. And they've, if you like, cornered a thing I sort of call Lutheran luxury, which is it's highly luxurious, but in a very minimalist Protestant Scandinavian way. Okay, Jaguar, I think you're right about the Britishness. I think Mark Ritson's right about the Britishness of the thing, which is they shouldn't turn their back on that, simply because there are large parts of the world where that still really matters. I mean, Britain's brand strength is pretty good. There are also a whole bunch of very rich people who, for reasons simply of differentiation, don't want to drive a Mercedes, and so Aston Martin, Bentley, Jaguar have all sort of, I suppose, had the capacity to appeal to those people.
And just as a final question, Rory, I wonder what went through your mind in deciding to buy those 5 Jaguars? What were the kind of motivations for them? What were you thinking when you thought, Jaguar, I want one of those?
They are slightly raffish,
yes,
which I quite like. However, I absolutely love the brand, but I'm also conscious of the fact that I'm 59. Okay, actually, that's actually comparatively slightly young for the buyer of new cars. We've got to remember that the people who buy new cars are old. overwhelmingly. My brother was also, and is, a Jag enthusiast, and he's now got an I-Pace, which he's delighted with. It was a very, very good car in many ways. I absolutely love the brand. I'm also conscious of the fact that it probably cannot survive exclusively on a group of people who love the brand but don't necessarily buy the cars. We've got to be very careful about this.
The Church of England problem, isn't it? People love the church.
The brand. I'm not going. I'm not going to church.
Yes.
No, I want it to exist.
Yes.
But I'm not going to participate.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And that's actually very common. It's very common with cars. There are an awful lot of car brands which I would never buy, but I would be saddened if they disappear. I still don't like going to France quite as much anymore because there aren't 2 CVs all over the place, you know. In many ways, it was a bloody awful car, but nonetheless, there are lots of things I'm really, really glad that they exist, but I'm not necessarily going to pay for them. And I think you've got to be careful about that because with car brands, particularly car brands, everybody's a commentator. It gets really complicated with brands. One of the things I think they are a little bit guilty of, and I'm totally with my friend Mark Ritson on this, is probably turning your back on a bit too much in the same way that British Airways did, which is British Airways is called British Airways, for God's sake. You know, it is fairly obviously a British airline. And there is that question with brands that try to be a citizen of everywhere. Who was it?
Theresa May.
Theresa May. If you want to be a citizen of everywhere, you end up as a citizen of nowhere. And for brands, there's probably a little bit of truth in that. That I don't think they should turn their back on that. But where I slightly disagree with the kind of critics is I'm reserving judgment because I'm still waiting for the car. I don't think brands without products, are really a thing. I personally don't dislike their design treatment. It's difficult to judge in the absence, again, of the actual product itself. So we're making a decision about a brand in the absence of the thing to which it's attached. And of course, cognitively, the two are inseparable, right? But why I reserve judgment as well is that yes, I accept. I think some of the criticism is right. The ad is not the ad I would have made or chosen to have made, but I do think there is a kind of seismic shift in the world of car brands, which is a necessary consequence simply of the Chinese. Okay, if you think about it, to some extent, 100 years of German credibility in terms of powertrains and engineering has been rendered slightly irrelevant in the same way that saddle makers had to reinvent themselves. Okay, I think Hermes was a saddle maker. If we're talking about luxury brands, is that right? I've got a vague memory that Hermes started as a French saddle maker and realised that actually that was a little bit of a dying market, so they went into luxury leather goods, and from then on, so on and so forth. And I think something like that's happening in the car industry. Much as a lot of purists would like to resist it, I don't think we can actually fight that.
Well, a bit like Rolls-Royce as well, in terms of what it ended up doing.
Yeah, I do feel Rolls-Royce, there is a comment I will make, and I'm going to be careful here. Rolls-Royce is a bit like the British private school system, which is it has abandoned its core audience, okay? So I don't know anybody British who drives a Rolls-Royce anymore. I used to know a few British people who would have them. And it has become a kind of luxury car for the world's plutocrats or mega rich or whatever. And I kind of do think that if this vehicle looks weird parked outside Chatsworth, you've lost something. In the same way that I think, the British public school system, where the headmaster on July the 27th is on a flight to Shanghai or Dubai to basically drum up the next year's intake. It's a perfectly sensible move up to a point, but if you actually become entirely rootless, you're no longer selling the thing that was appealing to those people in the first place.
It's a sort of Wimbledonisation element to it almost.
Perfect.
Succeeding overseas, etc. Well, we hope to see next week's car, and we'll see if Jaguar does keep its predictions.
How long is it before the car is revealed? I was checking the date.
I don't know off the top of my head.
I think it's Miami. I've got a vague idea it's some motor show in Miami, but I may be wrong.
Well, hopefully at that point we can get your views and you can tell us what do you think of the actual car as well. Rory Sutherland, thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV.
It's a pleasure as ever. Thank you very much indeed.